The British suppression of the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, 1952 to 1960, stands as one of the most brutal and consequential episodes of decolonization in Africa. The uprising was spearheaded by a secret Kikuyu-dominated society that sought to end British colonial rule and reclaim Kikuyu land, which had been seized by European settlers. The British response was a combination of military might, psychological warfare, and systematic repression, ultimately leading to the crushing of the Mau Mau movement but leaving deep scars on Kenyan society. By the mid-20th century, Kenya had been under British colonial rule for over half a century. The fertile Central Highlands, home to the Kikuyu people, had been seized by white settlers, displacing many Kikuyu from their ancestral lands. The settlers established large farms and plantations, forcing the Kikuyu to work as laborers under harsh conditions. Economic disparity, coupled with political disenfranchisement, led to growing resentment among the Kikuyu and other indigenous groups. The Mau Mau movement emerged from this background of economic hardship, cultural erosion, and political frustration. It was predominantly made up of Kikuyu, along with smaller numbers of Mbu and Meru people. Members took secret oaths to fight for their land and freedom, using both violent and non-violent means. While Mau Mau leaders saw themselves as freedom fighters, the British labeled them as terrorists, justifying the harsh crackdown that followed. When the uprising began in 1952, the British declared a state of emergency in Kenya, marking the start of a counterinsurgency campaign that would last until 1960. The British strategy was multifaceted, involving military operations, mass detentions, psychological warfare, and the co-option of African collaborators. The British conducted a series of military operations to suppress the Mau Mau fighters, who operated mainly in the forests of the Aberdare Range and Mount Kenya. The Mau Mau employed guerrilla tactics, striking settlers, loyalist Africans, and colonial forces, then retreating into the dense forests. In response, the British deployed over 55,000 troops, including British Army regiments. The King's African Rifles, composed of African soldiers loyal to the British and local police forces. They bombed suspected Mau Mau hideouts, launched ground offensives, and used superior firepower to outgun the poorly armed Mau Mau fighters. British forces also employed scorched earth tactics, burning crops and villages to deprive the Mau Mau of food and shelter. One of the most notorious aspects of the British counterinsurgency effort was the use of mass detentions. The colonial government rounded up tens of thousands of Kikuyu suspected of sympathizing with the Mau Mau and placed them in detention camps. These camps were marked by brutal conditions, including forced labor, inadequate food, overcrowding, and routine physical abuse. Interrogation often involved torture, with prisoners subjected to beatings, electric shocks, and other forms of cruelty. In parallel, the British instituted a policy of forced villagization. Hundreds of thousands of Kikuyu were moved from their homes and resettled in heavily guarded villages, which were essentially concentration camps. The aim was to isolate the Mau Mau fighters from their civilian supporters and cut off supplies to the guerrillas hiding in the forests. The British also employed psychological tactics to undermine the Mau Mau. This included the spread of propaganda aimed at discrediting the movement and portraying it as a cult of savages engaging in ritualistic violence. The colonial authorities used African loyalists, especially the Kikuyu Home Guard, to spread anti-Mau Mau sentiment and hunt down suspected rebels. The Home Guard was often more brutal than the British forces, as its members had personal grievances against the Mau Mau. The British authorities exploited internal divisions within the Kikuyu, presenting the conflict as a civil war between loyalists and insurgents rather than an anti-colonial rebellion. This strategy helped to fragment Mau Mau support, as some Kikuyu aligned themselves with the colonial government in return for protection and material rewards. Under the emergency regulations, the colonial government passed laws that gave it sweeping powers to detain, interrogate, and punish suspected Mau Mau members. Courts were set up to try Mau Mau suspects, often with little evidence or due process. Thousands were convicted, and nearly 1,100 Mau Mau members or sympathizers were executed by hanging. The executions, coupled with the brutal suppression in the camps and villages, served as a powerful deterrent to would-be rebels. By 1956, the British had largely succeeded in quelling the Mau Mau insurgency. The capture of key Mau Mau leaders, including Dedan Kimathi, signaled the collapse of the movement's leadership. However, sporadic violence continued for several years, and the state of emergency was only lifted in 1960. The cost of the uprising was enormous. By the end of the conflict, over 11,000 Mau Mau fighters had been killed, alongside hundreds of loyalist Africans and around 32 European settlers. While official British figures report fewer than 100,000 Kikuyu detained, independent estimates suggest that over 150,000 were imprisoned in camps or forced into villages. The camps, detention centers, and methods of torture used by the British became a dark chapter in colonial history, only fully exposed decades later. While the British crushed the Mau Mau uprising through military force, mass repression, and psychological manipulation, the movement left an indelible mark on Kenya's path to independence. Though defeated, the Mau Mau rebellion exposed the contradictions and brutality of colonial rule, galvanizing broader nationalist movements that ultimately led to Kenya gaining independence in 1963.